Today's episode is all about pattern recognition in bike fitting, and although this tends to fly under the radar, pattern recognition is essentially the basis of AI and motion capture systems like Retul, and how humans and bike fitters assess riders with their eye. In fact, humans are built to be extremely good at pattern recognition, and you're doing this every minute of the day, even if you don't know it. I'm joined by master bike fitter John Higgins, who's written an in-depth article on this subject. And so I wanted to get him on the podcast to explore some more of the details, including whether bike fitting is only relevant for riders who fall outside of the normative bell curve, or how do you understand your body proportions and what effect this has on your fit outcomes, which sometimes leads to really counterintuitive results. So if you're one of those riders who always feels like they're in between sizes, you're a size splitter, as John calls it, or you want to know why your position always looks different to the other riders around you, should you be trying to conform to what is traditionally regarded as a good position on the bike? Well, this is going to be a great episode for you.
Welcome to Cycling Demystified, brought to you by Foundation Bike Fit and Frequency Cycle Works, the podcast where we help you take your cycling to the next level by sharing the knowledge from experienced bike fitters, mechanics, and the hidden players within the bike industry.
All right, welcome to the podcast, or welcome back to the podcast, John Higgins, all the way from America. What time is it over there at the moment?
10 o'clock in the morning, so I'm caffeinated and ready to go.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming back on again. It's been a while since we actually met back in Eurobike, about 6 weeks ago now. Time has flown. And,
when you're busy and having fun, yeah. Delighted to be invited back for another conversation.
Yeah, hopefully you've recovered from your Eurobike experience.
It took a while.
Yeah.
There was a lot to recover from. It was a fabulous experience, which meant recovery was long.
Yeah, it was a bit of a unique experience to recover from, so all good. Today, we wanted to get you on the podcast because you wrote a fascinating article all about body patterns. And as a practitioner who's always trying to learn and to discover new things or old new things, we're always looking for other practitioners to give us their perspective on how they go about the same practice. I've always likened bike fitters just like chefs. You know, we're all trying to cook you a nice meal, but we all go about it in different ways. And I think your article about body patterns really got me thinking again about going back to kind of, well, I was going to say going back to basics, but it's not. I guess it is basics, but that doesn't make it any more or less relevant or more or less important in what we do. I'd love you to tell us a little bit more about maybe what prompted the article, give us a quick overview, and then we can discuss some of the different parts of it and see where we go from there.
Yeah, that'd be great. Well, I think to step back to a way larger context, the way our brain's constantly taking in inputs, visual, auditory, sensory inputs, all sorts of nerve stimulations, and it's a lot to process and make sense of. And often we have to make some pretty quick decisions, like we think back to survival mode stuff. And so we have to process a lot of information very quickly and make a decision. And one way the brain does that is to make some assumptions, essentially, about a whole set of data. And essentially that's what's called pattern recognition. And that's what artificial intelligence is using, and that's what machine learning is using. It's like it's looking for patterns in a huge amount of data, and it's looking for the commonalities and the relationships. And I think unconsciously we do that as bike fitters when we're looking at a person, when we look at how they move off the bike, when we look at how they interact and move on the bike, we're looking for those patterns. Now, we may not consciously recognize that, but in many ways that's what we're up to. And I wanted to bring some, conscious awareness and understanding of, and the ability to use those patterns in a more meaningful way. So not just recognize them and go, what are the implications of this, and how can we use them for a better fit outcome for our customers?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think that's what we do when we're riding around the park all the time. We're looking at other riders and going, oh, they look horrible on the bike, or they look great on the bike. Or I think you mentioned in the article about the conundrum of bike fitters wanting to make sure that a bike fit is individualized for a specific rider. But at the same time, we are trying to conform people to what a bike rider should look like. In many ways, a bike rider has to adopt a particular set of movement patterns to be able to ride a bike. So we are constrained within a mold of cycling, but we still have to be individualized. So there's two opposing things at work there.
Yeah. And in some ways, I credit Dan Empfield, recently retired bike fit educator in the US, was sort of putting this out there earlier, where he talked about the idea of what is a consensus fit. And I think relating it back to the earlier days of bicycle frame building, when all bikes were custom made. And so when every bike was a custom steel fabrication, then the frame builder was really trying to assess that individual and make that bike just for that one person. Then with the rise of production frames, so standardized geometries across a range of frame sizes, then it's like, well, okay, here's 5 or 6 choices, and everybody can fit one of those 5 or 6 choices. And so then if we then take sort of that frame production, frame building to bike fitting, it's like, to what extent do we individualize the fit, and to what extent do we recognize, well, people are going to fall in a certain pattern or fit on a particular size of bike or a particular geometry. And so I don't think it's one or the other. It's holding both seemingly different concepts and then blending them together. And Dan promoted the idea of a consensus fit, which is like when we see someone who looks good on a bike, we know that, we recognize that, there's certain characteristics about that. And the same when we see someone who we think, well, they really should come in for a bike fit, you're almost compelled to tap them on the shoulder and suggest that to them. Then again, we're seeing some sort of pattern that's giving us signals that something's not right. Yeah, we still have to individualize for the person, but we need a starting point, in essence.
Yeah.
And so if we understand that body and how they relate to the bike and how most folks do, then we've got that starting point. And then we have to tweak from there for the individual.
Is this kind of where you started your kind of bike fit journey as a fitter? Is this a
it is, yeah.
idea that kind of where you learned bike fitting, as it were, rather than, and for me, for example, it was just looking at people moving on the bike and then trying to understand that movement rather than looking at measuring the body lengths and so on.
Yeah, I think every fitter who starts out is heavily influenced by what they're exposed to first, or those early mentors or educators or the aha moments they might have had. And for me, it was being trained with the FitKit system. And a key basis of that, and not the only part of it, but a key basis was measuring someone's body in terms of legs, inseam measurement, torso, arms, to have an understanding of how they were put together. So using body measurements as a basis. Now, if we go back 40 years, those numbers were used in a formula to give some ideas of a frame size and a geometry and some metrics around the frame. What I'm using those body measurements now is more for pattern recognition and looking at different proportional bodies of different proportional types and looking at the implications of that for how they fit on the bike. So it does go back to my beginnings in bike fitting over 15 years ago of measuring bodies, and I was doing a lot of that, and it didn't take too long before I started to see, oh, this person's like that person. Oh, this person's got similar to that. Oh, this person's different. Like they're the inverse of that person. And just started through that experience sort of accumulating this sort of mental model of, yes, everybody measures slightly differently, but within a range. And we can sort of apply, standard high school mathematics and statistics and look at a normalized bell curve to this and go, well, the bulk of the people are in this range, but there's these outliers. And in bike fitting, we tend to get the outliers. Like people who are in the middle of the bell curve and fit easily on a bike, because bikes are designed for people in the middle of the bell curve, like they have less fit issues. But those outliers, they're the ones that struggle on the bike and are fighting the bike and have more aches and pains. They're the ones more likely to show up in a bike fit studio for an appointment, not understanding why they're having so much trouble, and their partner or their riding buddies are like, what's the issue? Like, we don't have any of those things going on. Like, what's your problem? And so they sort of come in wondering if they're the problem or what the problem is. But they're the outlier humans, and they're challenging to work with, and they're fun to work with, and once they understand why they're having the issues they are with the bike, they're super grateful. Because they realise it's not them, as such. It's nothing they're doing wrong. It's just the bike hasn't been designed and set up for their particular body pattern.
I liken it to we were talking earlier about the outliers that we see within the bike fit studio. They kind of know that they're outliers because they've gone through other processes like choosing clothes. And when they go into the store, they're like, all the sleeves are always too short. And so they understand that maybe they have slightly longer limbs than, the normative range is. And that's always a challenge for them. And so that becomes then also something that they can bring to bike fitting or their bike position. And so,
exactly,
just in the same way that your clothes also have to be tailored, but there are normal size. There's a medium, small, and large within clothes, and most people will kind of fit within that. But if you lie outside of that, then you're going to get your sleeves adjusted to fit.
And if you wanted the perfect fit, you'd need more customization, more hemming up or lengthening or expanding or contracting in different parts of the clothing.
Yeah.
And
maybe that's an interesting analogy as well, because when you first go to buy clothes, when you're a kid and you're trying to figure out what size you are, inevitably you do get measured, or like when I was a kid working in a shoe shop, you'd go in and you get measured for your shoes, and you'd figure out, okay, I need this size, or my left foot's a little bit smaller than my right foot. And you have to have some context. You have to have a starting point of okay, this is your inseam, and so you're likely going to be round about this size. But then throughout your life, you don't measure your inseam every time you go and try a new pair of trousers. You know that you're round about there, so you try on those trousers, and it should be round about right.
Yeah.
So maybe it's a little bit like that for bikes.
Yeah, although clothes are more forgiving than bikes, so you can get away with a lot more. That's a soft fabric. It's got more give. The bicycles are a hard material.
Yeah.
No, let's give. Not counting any flex in the carbon frame, but yes.
So walk us through some of the body measurements that you go through this system that you've been practicing. That's about when you measure, why you measure it.
So measuring, for me, it's part of the off-bike movement assessment. So I think of it as a movement and measurement assessment. So when a customer comes in, I've had them do a pre-fit interview. We talk through that and flesh that out more. So that conversation about why they're there and what their objectives are and issues and all of that. And I then move into an off-bike movement screen to look at mobility and strength and stability, and then into body measurement. And the key 4 measurements I'm taking are foot length, inseam length, a torso length, and an arm length. I'm also doing sort of shoulders and sit bones, but the 4 key ones are the foot, inseam, torso, and arm. There's a great little acronym for that, FITA, fitter, so it's easy to remember. And then traditionally people using body measurements might have then said, well, okay, here's a formula and here's what size bike, or here's how you set the seat height. And I do sort of pay a cursory look at that, but mostly what I'm looking at is I'm looking at sort of really 2 things. I'm trying to understand how is that person put together. And I'm thinking about the leg to the lower limbs, not the lower limbs, the legs and the torso relationship, so lower body, upper body. And then I'm looking at torso to arm relationships. So the primary one is for that person's height. Are they fairly balanced, like that middle of the bell curve person? Or are they torso dominant, in which they've got relatively shorter legs and a longer torso for their height? Or are they the opposite of that? Are they leg dominant? So they've got a lot of leg length, relatively short torso for their height. So as a generalization, people will sort of fall into one of those 3 sort of primary patterns. And there's implications for those patterns in terms of the bike fit, which we can get into. The second thing I'm looking at is their arm to torso ratio. And to define torso here, this is like from the crotch to the sternal notch. Crotch to notch, essentially your pubic bone up to the top. So it's not from the waist up, it's from the bottom of the pelvis up. So the standard issue human, if you like, is a 1-to-1 arm to torso ratio, for both men and women. But then you'll have people with what rock climbers might call a positive ape factor, so much longer arms relative to their torso. So they've got more arm length, and that's there is a gender bias for men to present more like this. Certainly women do, but more men are more likely to have a positive arm to torso ratio. And that has implications for the reach and drop to the handlebars in my experience. And then a negative arm to torso ratio is where the arms are shorter than the torso, and that is more predominant amongst females. And I've got the numbers to statistically prove that out. And again, that has implications for reach and drop, and it's why I think there is some differences in fitting for men and women in terms of expectations and what's a good position. We need to find good position, but what's an appropriate position, shall we say, can be different depending on those body patterns. So that's just 4 measurements. Some fitters I know might get into lower limb, like forearm, upper arm, or tibia, femur. I'm not sure that too many are doing that these days, but certainly in the past there's been. And there's some interesting sort of relationships and implications there, but I haven't dived into those more smaller segment measurements myself.
Yeah, I guess the attractive thing about this, taking those kind of measurements, is that you can almost see straight away where the patterns are, and therefore certainly if you're sizing for a new bike and you're using, say, a sizing cycle and you've got to start somewhere, then you can immediately kind of get a picture of what's going to work and what's not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I use a size cycle. I do a lot of pre-purchase fit sessions, so people getting measured up and figured out in advance of buying a bike. And this is not the only thing I use, but it's certainly it's a layer of information I bring into setting up the size cycle for that session and understanding where the position might go.
Let's go back to kind of body proportions and that torso dominant and leg dominant. I like those ideas, or describing those kind of types of bodies in that kind of style. But could you give the listeners an idea of what implications those body shape types have on the shape of their bike?
For sure. I think bikes generally, certainly your race geometry bikes, tend to favour the torso dominant person. And so the torso lives in space on the bike, we could say a 45-degree angle, but in essence the torso has more influence horizontally along the bike than it does vertically. And so a bike with a longer top tube or a longer reach number, all things being equal, and there's some heavy modifiers to this, but all things being equal, someone who's more torso dominant will want more reach in their bike, but their seat height will be relatively lower. Now your leg dominant person, myself for example, one of your other podcast guests, Ronan from Form Bike Fitting, so we're both very leg dominant.
Super leggy.
That puts our seat way up high to get an optimal leg extension. And the challenge is, well, how do we match the handlebar height proportionally to that without stretching out too much? So we want a bike that is shorter in the length. We have a tall, relatively speaking, seat height. And the challenge is bringing the front end up high enough so that we're not too bent over or too weight forward on the bike or too stretched out to reach down to the handlebars. So race geometry bikes tend to work against us. Work against the leg dominant people.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I find this is a great starting point, and it describes an area where you might expect a rider to go. But as you were saying earlier, there's a lot of other things that can influence what a rider might end up on, including mobility, the ability to hinge. If they're able to hinge their body forward more than that 45 degrees, then and they are a leg dominant person, they might actually end up with a relatively balanced bike position because they can reach.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way I look at this is that the body measurement's essentially a skeletal anthropometric measurements. And that's like, humans are built on something. We're built on a skeleton. And so that skeleton sets the baseline sort of reference point. So the body measurements are measuring aspects of the skeleton. And then layered on top of that is the soft tissue, the muscles, ligaments, tendons, fascia, that then moves the skeleton around to perform tasks. And so the mobility there, that flexibility, the strength, definitely influences how that underlying skeleton can be deployed. So if somebody's particularly, so let's say somebody is torso dominant, if they've got great flexibility in the spine, an excellent hip hinge, good posterior chain mobility, they can deploy that length or a greater amount of it more effectively than somebody who's stiff in the back, tight posterior chain, poor hip hinge, a little kyphotic in the upper body, getting a little hunched over. So although that second person may measure the same skeletally, functionally they may be compromised and so not able to use that in the same way on the bike. So we've got to layer that in.
Yeah.
You know, what's their age, what's their riding attention, how hard charging are they, all of that's going to get layered on top. So I'm not looking at those body measurements, those body patterns in isolation. I'm just sort of putting it in there as a perspective or a layer of information, and other things modify that or provide nuance to how I might interpret it.
I guess it helps us funnel people towards that kind of more ideal bike fit that we're trying to get to. If you have a certain body height, then you're not suddenly going to change a bike size or something like that. So, it kind of helps to kind of funnel people in. But yeah, we have to use it as a way of, in amongst all the other tools that we have and all the rest of the functionality that we're looking at within a bike rider.
Yeah. It's a way to explain, like a lot of people are what we think of as size splitters. So it's like what size bike should they be riding, or what geometry of bike, and it's a way to explain this to the cyclist. And particularly like a torso dominant person, they'll often be on their legs want to be on a smaller frame and their upper body wants to be on a larger frame. So there's going to be an element of compromise, and it's like, well, which way do you bias that, and what do you do about it, and how do you accommodate this disparity? And the same with a leg dominant person, their legs want to be on a larger frame size, but their upper body wants to be on a smaller frame size. And so again, we've got this conflict. And so as bike fitters, our challenge is to decide, well, do we upsize or downsize? And then there's going to be an implication and a consequence of that. So how do we deal with that implication?
Yeah.
So if we upsize for that leg dominant person to take into account their leg length, then how do we make the bike shorter? Like, how short can we bring that stem without compromising the handling and finessing of the bike? And the same for the torso dominant person. If they're on a smaller bike, to get that standover clearance, to get the saddle height appropriate, how do we make it long enough and keep their weight distributed over the bike? And particularly for that person, we don't want to just send all that weight out over the front.
Yeah.
I'm going to deviate here into setback. So for me, one of the big things I get out of body patterns is an idea of saddle setback. But for me, the key driver of this is weight distribution and the center of mass of the rider. But someone with a longer upper body, a torso dominant person, we don't want to just project that all out the front of the bike. We've got to weight distribute and get some of that weight back behind the bottom bracket. And so this plays into that fore-aft saddle positioning. So it's not just a matter of slapping a longer stem on a smaller bike for that torso dominant person. I'm often looking to increase saddle setback. But we have to do that as well as shortening the crank length. Otherwise, we're going to end up with the solution to one problem causing another problem.
Yeah.
And so all of this stuff has to play together.
Yeah. And I think you touched on it earlier, talking about getting into the next layer of nuance between like lower limbs, femur versus tibia, and the lower leg, upper leg versus lower leg. And so do you see that playing a role in kind of choosing things like setback and so on?
So I don't, as I said, some people will focus on the tibia versus femur proportions, and I haven't so far. There's things to learn there, and I know some fitters do, and I've got some thinking on that, but I don't have the same, because I'm not measuring that currently. I don't have the data and I don't have the sort of information to support that. But if we go back in bike fitting history, a rule of thumb was that the longer the femur, the greater the saddle setback. Was kind of a thing. And I'd say from my research and experience, I can confidently say I've debunked that, in that, because often that person is actually leg dominant and has quite a short torso, and I will prioritize dealing with center of mass and dealing with the consequences of gravity over femur length. And that will often bring that rider further forward than historical bike fitters would have positioned somebody. So I've maybe come at it a different way. I come at it from a how do I help the rider's body contend with gravity when they're on the bike, rather than focusing on what's their relative lower leg, upper leg proportion.
Yeah, I think one of the trickiest fits I had was someone who was very leg dominant, but also had a really muscular upper body and really long arms at the same time. There's all these kind of conflicting things of having a really high seat height. You had to have such a high seat height. But he could lean forward quite a bit, and because of his long arms, he needed quite a bit of drop on his handlebars. But then he had disproportionately. He was like a bodybuilder, so an interesting bodybuilder, because usually, I don't know, the bodybuilders don't tend to have such long legs, but this guy had really long legs but huge shoulders, and it was really tricky just to get that centre of mass right, so that he could pedal effectively. And I think we ended up on something like 160 cranks for someone who's over 6'4" or something like that, and he was just like, what is going on?
We should talk about that torso to arm ratio. So what I sort of came to with that is that someone who has a positive arm to torso ratio, so longer arms, I mean, those arms have to live in space somewhere. And if the space is not arranged appropriately, then there's going to be some muscular compensation, and then some tensions, and then some aches and pains will build up in its wake. And although the arms come forward, unless we're in and we're thinking sort of road bikes here for the most part, or drop bars, the arms tend to have a bigger influence vertically than they do horizontally. And so for me, someone with that positive arm to torso ratio, again, all things being equal in terms of mobility, strength, etc., will prefer more saddle to bar drop. And if they don't have it, their shoulders will come back up. So the hands can't go any further forward because they're stuck on the bars. So what happens, that energy turns around and goes back up into the shoulders, and so they'll either hunch in the shoulders, or they'll start to buckle and curve in the spine and push away from the bars to relieve hand pressure. And so then you'll get upper shoulder, neck, back tension, a deterioration in posture, spinal posture on the bike.
I think that's one of the interesting things that happens during a fit when people are having discomfort through shoulders and hands. You lower the handlebars and they're like, oh, that suddenly got really comfortable. Like, how is that possible? Because there seems to be the default seems to be
the shorter, taller approach.
Yeah, everyone's like, well, if you're uncomfortable in your hands, just raise the handlebars and bring it back towards you, and you'll be fine.
Right. Which for certain body patterns works extremely well, but has the opposite effect for other types of people. I did have a real aha moment during a fit session around this one time, where a cyclist came in to see me, having had a fit about 3 months before, and they brought the handlebars back and I think raised them up. And this person was very torso dominant and a lot of upper body mass. And essentially they were just too scrunched up on the bike, and they were really loading their hands up because they were trying to push their hands away. And I sort of ended up doing the opposite. And I think they were also, very arm dominant as well. So I took the bars out and down, and it was like there was this immediate sound of relief from the cyclist because it gave space for their body to function more happily in. And so, yeah, that idea of just like, well, if you're uncomfortable, shorten and raise that's not always the answer for sure. It can be the opposite. Having said that, and this is an opinion, I don't have the evidence to fully back it up, but it's a sort of an observational opinion, is that too many women are too stretched out and too low on bikes. And that's causing a lot more anterior pelvic rotation, a lot more discomfort on the saddle, because they're sort of being set up to emulate the position of someone with a different sort of body proportion. And often they have the flexibility to get away with it, or to appear as though they're getting away with it, but it's actually putting the body under excessive load and strain with some negative consequences.
Absolutely. Women tend to have better hip mobility, and so they can get into the shapes, but whether or not they can sustain it is another thing.
Yeah, and that's a critical distinction, like the ability to adopt a position on the bike and the ability to sustain it over a 2, 4, 6 hour ride are two very different things.
So I guess this is where having some normative ranges of this is where people generally do sit might give you an idea of, well, you're kind of trending towards the kind of end range, whether it's like kind of too low or too high, and so this is where you may test your bike. Maybe if you find it's a little bit too unsustainable, then you may go in this direction.
It's I had a thought there. Which I lost.
This made me think about
thoughts come and go.
Helping riders actually choose bikes as well onto geometry, going back to geometry and knowing your body proportions and maybe knowing if you have a particular proportion and a particular posture for the moment. There may be you can kind of foresee into the future. If you look into the future, if this person changed their posture, then they would be able to adopt this kind of position or this kind of position. So there's a potential to look further than just the initial kind of bike fit if you have some body proportions recorded.
Yeah, I mean, most tigers don't change their stripes too much, but occasionally we'll see people who are maybe physically out of condition, lacking some core strength, a little too heavy in the upper body. They're proactively looking to improve their physical condition, and then there's the question: do we set them up for how they are now, or do we set them up for where they're trending towards? Or do we say you need to come back in 6 months or 12 months or what have you, and we'll sort of readjust this? So there's like fitting a person for where they're at now, and then where they might be if they do the off-bike work that's necessary to have enough significant transformation where a refit or an adjustment is in order.
That's always the $1 million question for us. Who's going to actually do the transformation work that they need to, or what's the difference?
The answer is very few. In reality. Yeah. That thought came to mind. You're talking about normative ranges for the body patterns. What it can do for me is sort of help keep me in check, or help me keep the rider in check, so that I'll have to think carefully or think twice. If someone's getting out of what I expect, it's like, what's the reason for that, and is that a good reason, is that a valid reason, or is there some sort of compensation going on here that might sort of come back to bite us further down the track? So it's not using a formula hold hard and fast to this is how it must be. It's just this perspective balanced with other ones, and you're sort of always weighing up the pros and cons. And sometimes you might err in the wrong direction and then have to come back and fix that later on. Like, I've definitely fallen into the trap of stretching some people out too far because they could stretch out too far, but then subsequently found they couldn't sustain it. And if I go back and I relook at the numbers in terms of their body measurements and their body pattern, it's like, oh yeah, I should have seen that coming. It's like, I didn't keep myself in check.
I guess that's also why we generally offer follow-up fits as well, just to make sure that what we hypothesized or decided on during that initial fit session, does it actually translate into reality? Is it sustainable?
Yeah,
Is that person...
does it prove out?
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I had a thought about riders choosing geometry and maybe discerning what geometry suits them better, rather than relying on the usual marketing terms of like, this is an endurance bike and this is a race bike, and those terms seem to be synonymous with certain geometric proportions, and it's really confusing for riders. Especially if you're a leg dominant rider, you'll end up on what is a relatively short and tall bike, and that is again marketed as an endurance road bike most of the time.
I'd be cautious about offering too much guidance to cyclists here, because it's like trying to measure yourself for your own suit and then make it. It's and then the marketing phrases, like there's bikes marketed as endurance geometry bikes, but they're very race geometry in reality when you look under the hood and get to the actual frame numbers.
And I've never really realised why, or understood why doesn't a company just make the same bike with the same kind of fiddling characteristics, but just offer it in different shapes, so that different shape riders would actually ride it. And
exactly. I mean, what's frustrating is my bike fit clientele are largely recreational cyclists. You know, I'm not dealing with pro athletes, pro peloton folks. I'm dealing with your full-time job, after work, weekend cyclists, some of who compete and may compete at a high level, you know, locally. Many don't at all. They might compete against themselves or their virtual racing buddies on Strava segments. I certainly have a few of those. So they're riding hard, they're riding competitively, even if they're not competing. And I mean, the age range varies, but I think the biggest frustration is somebody with who you know, they're not doing any yoga or Pilates, they're not doing any strength training, they're a little overweight, they're trying to ride hard. Their mobility is not as good as it could be, and they want to ride a race, in quotes, bike, because that's what's marketed as being what will make them faster. And so the sex appeal of that is very attractive. But the physicality of their body doesn't lend itself well to it. And so then they're on the endurance geometry bike, which is cheaped out, it's heavier, it's got lower quality components, and they're frustrated by that, even though it fits them better. So I agree, there is an issue. Bike brands could do a better job of offering a lighter weight, racier bike in a more appropriate geometry for the bulk of the buying public.
But they do exist. So it's just, I guess, at the end of the day, just knowing what do you need as a bike rider. And I guess one way to, the best way to find that out is obviously come in for a bike fit. And, get someone to explain to you, you know, what do you need, and that might be based on body proportions, but also the combination of body proportions plus mobility, injury history, riding goals, all the rest of it.
Exactly. And someone who maybe is better off on an endurance geometry bike might be fine on a race geometry for an hour or so. And if that's what they're riding, then they're not going to accumulate the fatigue and stress that's going to be detrimental. But if they're wanting to do Gran Fondo style rides, metric or imperial century rides, they're on the bike for 5, 6, 7 hours, then that race geometry, which is fine for an after work hour ride, may not serve them well. So it's where are the priorities and what's the riding intention and duration, and where might things start to fall apart. So there's a lot of variables to consider there. I guess I recently
go for it.
I recently had a client I ran into on a group ride who started out as a novice cyclist. Younger guy, married, kids, corporate job, stressful corporate job, riding a few days a week, gets out on the weekend. I mean, he wanted that race geometry bike that sort of suited his mentality, his aspirational cycling goals, but he just could not get, and he came in with one, and it was like, wrong bike. We just couldn't get him comfortable on it. So he did change to that endurance geometry, and he had that for several years and rode very happily on it. But his cycling developed, and his body developed, and he got more adapted to cycling, and then he got himself a race geometry, and he's good for it now. He can ride that very capably, very happily for longer durations. But he put in the work, changed his diet, changed his nutrition. Like, he did a lot of things to prepare himself to make that bike a viable candidate for him. Yeah. And he's like, I love how it handles. It feels so much more lively. It's faster. It's less weight. Yeah. That he can now enjoy the attributes of the bike that he wanted in the first place. But initially, it was like the aches and pains were outdoing the perceived benefits.
Yeah, a very good example of how everything is temporary.
Yeah.
What might be today is not what will be in years to come. So they can swing in both directions. But if that initial bike was the launch pad for him to get to where he wants to be, then that's a worthy investment in his time and effort and money to get to where he wanted to go, which is great. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it did provide that launch, but if he'd stayed on it, he was probably at a high risk of exiting the sport because he wasn't having fun on it.
Yeah.
And so there was this mismatch between like ideal and intention and the actual experience. Yeah, and he had the financial resources to change bikes, enjoy cycling more, develop more as a cyclist. Then he could come back to that, sports car equivalent.
Like how this conversation's gone from objective limb measurements, physiological limb measurements, to the psychological, subjective dreams that our writers have wanted to go to.
Well, these are all part of the things we deal with as bike fitters. I mean, it's a deep bag of skills. I mean, we're part sports psychologists, part bike mechanics, part body measures, part movement assessors, coaches, counsellors, therapists. Yeah, it's a diverse skill set required.
Absolutely.
But that's why I say, like, the body measurements and looking at body patterns, that's like a perspective, and we've got to layer in all those other things as well. But if I circle back to something you said earlier, I mean, you're in your own fit practice, you're seeing these patterns through experience, but you're seeing them subjectively, whereas I encourage fitters to take what I call hard measurements, get the data, have an actual number, and then you've got a more quantifiable piece of information that you can work with. And some people some people can look one way but actually measure a different way. Sometimes you get visual distortion. If someone's particularly thin or particularly overweight, you get a lot of visual distortion around their limb length and their proportions. And so subjectively you can think, oh, this is, person's built this way, but they're actually like built a different way.
Yeah.
And so it's like what I'm trying to do is sort of remove that error, that subjective error, and get some hard numbers.
Yeah, we definitely bring our own
that.
biases to whatever situation. No matter how many bodies I've seen, I still have my own biases as a fitter and as a person. And so when you're presented with a particular body, there are some things that you yourself are looking for. And so having a way of objectively checking is always good, always useful.
Yeah. It also provides a language and a tool to explain to the cyclist things they may or may not know about themselves, and also how they compare to others. And again, everyone wants to be an individual, but no one wants to be the exception. No one wants to be so different to everyone else. There's still that desire to be similar to others. No one wants to be sort of, ostracized in a way. And so when I can say to somebody, well, this is your body pattern and this is common, and I see this a lot, and these are the implications for the bike fit. Like, there's a sense of relief for the person, and it legitimizes the fact that they can ride. Like, some people come in thinking, well, maybe cycling's not for me. I can't be a cyclist at all. All my riding buddies, men friends or women friends don't have these issues. Like, why do you, they're asking, why do you need a bike fit? Like, I don't need a bike fit. Why do you need a bike fit? And so the person feels like there's something wrong with them. And so to be able to explain to them how they're put together and why their bike's working for them or not, that provides us the therapy session for the cyclist. That provides, emotional relief and a sense of understanding for them, which they're grateful for.
Right, and actually, I think that's probably a great place to leave it. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time. I have to run, but I could I could go on for hours. And what just popped into my mind was also just talking about different disciplines of riding. Even though you have the same limb proportions, if you're riding a mountain bike or time trial bike, you're in a completely different position. Even though you do have those same measurements, but that's another discussion, I think, for another time.
Yeah, it definitely applies to different types of bikes, but in different ways. If it's a tri bike, mountain bike, it definitely carries on influences that fits on those different types of equipment.
So thanks for joining us, John. It's been a real pleasure having you on and all your thoughts and experience with us. Where can people find you if they want to find out where you're based physically and on the great interweb?
Physically in Salt Lake City, Utah in the United States. Virtually a couple of different websites, but fitkitsystems.com. I don't pod, but I blog. And so I have a fairly in-depth article on this topic in the blog articles. You might drop a link into that in your show notes. For people curious about this and wanting to learn more, I sort of take a deeper dive into it in this blog article.
Yeah, I'll leave a link to that. Yeah, awesome. And your Bike Fit studio as well. Do you have a website?
Yes, Bike Fitter, creative spelling, FIR for the fitter. Currently being redesigned as we speak. So should have a brand new website up and running in about a month. Just got to finish up the staging site and make it live. So yeah, essentially business to business and direct to consumer bike fit products and information through FitKit Systems, and my personal bike fitting studio is bikefitter.com. So yeah, I'm measuring people most every day, practicing what I preach, getting evidence, accumulating research data, and having a good time.
Yeah, we didn't even get up to kind of using that data for kind of creating new geometries for bikes. But maybe we'll do that on the next podcast. So,
we will
stuff.
meet again.
Indeed, absolutely. Thanks so much, John, and yeah, we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you, Wade. Okay, bye-bye.
Suffering from numb hands, tingling toes, and any other persistent discomforts when you ride? These are all signs that your bike fit could be improved. If you're bike fit curious, get in touch with Way or Matt by emailing info@foundation.fit or finding them on Instagram @FDN_bikefit. Finally, for all your bike servicing needs, custom dream bike or hand-built wheels, go to www.frequencycycleworks.com or find me on Instagram @frequencycycleworks. Until next time, keep on spinning.
Wait.